Okay, this is John Reed, and this is the Sapphire tradition like no other. This is commandeering the empty room and hope I don't get erupted, and Josh Greenbaum is here.
Yes, the gorilla podcast.
Oh my God.
Deep in the bowels of the Hilton.
Yes, this is Thursday morning. This is the transition day. We had 3 full days, including a analyst full day, which was a topic unto itself. Just a quick shout out to Dick Hirsch, because many, many years ago when I taped these, we would always find a room like this. So Dick, wherever you are, I tip my caffeine to you because we definitely need the caffeine today.
Yep. It was a good week, but long and hard.
So for the listeners, we're probably starting to get over saturation on the podcast. So you're probably thinking, well, I've already listened to a podcast. Well, Josh and I are going to try to avoid too much duplication from prior episodes, but just for reference, we did a live SAP watch party for the day one keynote, the morning keynote, and the highlight reel for that is posted as an audio file already. So that has the bulk of the keynote reaction. So we're not going to spend much time on that. You and I also taped an Ask Us Anything with customers on the show floor, which was interesting.
Yes, very interesting.
That was a collaboration with ASUG Talks, and that podcast is not out yet, and I don't know the schedule for that, but when it hits...
And that was Jeff Scott joined us, or we joined Jeff Scott. I guess is a better way to put it.
Jeff had a lot to say that day, and a lot of it was interesting, so I think y'all enjoy that one. And then I taped a podcast with UK ASUG Chief Connor Riordan last night, and he did a really good job and also revisited some of his arguments around why business cases are so important, which is a topic you and I care about a lot.
Yep.
And he revisited that in the context of some of the announcements around the new agents around implementation, Joule for consulting and stuff like that. We're not going to spend a ton of time on that today. And we're also not going to be hitting some of our big talking points. We've hit a lot around hammering SAP on showcasing small partners. I've taken that topic off the table. So what we're going to challenge ourselves to do today is to give you mostly all new content. Obviously, there's going to be some repeats, but I got a few questions I really want to ask Josh that I think you're going to find interesting. So that's it. New, fresh content, Josh. That's our challenge.
Okay. I think we got, there's a lot of content.
There's a lot to talk about. We have been in a whole bunch of meetings, customer interviews, one-on-ones. We've pushed the envelope. We also met with the German user group, and all of that was off the record. It was a fascinating conversation we can also draw on. We will touch on the API controversy, I promise, but that's not where we're going to start. Here's where I want to start. Josh, what's top of mind for you? What's the thing that you're really thinking about right now in regards to this week?
I'm thinking that there's a tension that's building in my mind between the promise of agentic AI and some of the things we saw in the, on the show floor, in the keynotes from the customers, and how that is actually going to play out for customers in the real world. And my concern is that there's there's quite a number of customer examples that are showing up where SAP's talking about this ability to draw, a decent to great ROI out of building on this agentic AI promise. And my concern is twofold. One, that I'm looking at some of these with a sort of a careful lens and seeing that maybe that ROI isn't necessarily going to be just not just due to AI. In fact, it may be an ROI independent of AI of any kind. Number one. And number two, I have a concern that pushing too hard on agentic, which definitely did, I feel, happen during this Sapphire, may actually...
You felt it did happen.
Yeah, I think it was a little too hard and too deep. I think that may actually have an impact of stalling some deals as customers have to recalibrate what their focus is going to be in terms of their transformation and migration projects. So that's one of my top problems walking into this.
Yeah, and I want to get a little deeper into the AI discussion and how your views have changed or not changed. But a while back, I wrote an Opus piece on Diginomica on getting agentic AI projects right, what's working and what's not. And I went through 3 things enterprise AI is getting right. And it's all about shifting away from the big AI frontier model mentality, right? And in fact, a lot of those models aren't needed for a lot of these enterprise use cases anyway, which really helps to shift the cost equation for customers a bit, but customers are still catching up with that part of it. But of the 3 points that I talk about the three things enterprise are getting right, which is context at the time of inference, and we'll get back to that during this conversation. And the second, I think, is deeply relevant to your views, which is constraining LLMs in what I call a compound systems architecture, where the LLMs are combined with other forms of machine learning, deterministic systems, external tool calls to verifiers and rule-based automation or other sources of database truth. There's a lot in there, but I think sometimes we lose track of that because we lose track of the fact that the good stuff happens in the context of everything else that you've built and honed, right? And all the hard work you put in on your data infrastructure and all of that. And, vendors have done this all spring where they haven't shown enough examples of customers really currently kicking ass on more modern versions of their technology where they put in the time, right? They put in the data discipline, they've done the upgrades to the core systems, and they're already transforming their business. They're not waiting for agents to do that. They're already on the path. And the cruel reality, in my opinion, of agentic AI is that where the wins are coming, it rewards the companies that are already pushing their entire organization forward already. If you haven't done that, you're just going to get exposed. And that's where your silo conversation, I think, comes in, where all the silos get exposed. And I'm sure you'll have something to say about that today. But anyway, I just think it's really interesting. And I will give SAP a quick shout out that I think some of the customers they put in their keynotes, in particular on the first keynote with H&M and JP Morgan Chase, really rammed that point home from the customer perspective. Not SAP talking points, but basically saying like, the reason we're ready to think about AI now is because of all the stuff we've done already.
Right.
Yeah. So, all right. So let's get back to that a little bit, but there's some other stuff too. And I don't know what else you want to talk about, but I'm thinking you probably want to update listeners on your Toolchain sort of discussions and research, because you've been a real advocate for the potential there. And you and I have had some back and forth around what that can mean for customers. Where do you think we are now with that?
Yeah. And I think that's, obviously a favorite of mine for various reasons, but I think there was a really, an important little 2 minutes in the sunshine for Søren Reuter, the head of the Toolchain group, particularly the Cloud ALM group, during the keynote to really showcase some of the stuff that they're doing with Toolchain, particularly putting together assistants. And assistants, of course, are sort of a superset of agents that do a complex set of tasks using multiple agents. And what the Toolchain folks have done is actually say, okay, we've got this group of tools that we've acquired or built. There's been some integration problems. John has really pointed that out. You've been good at holding us to the fire on that in particular. But one of the things that assistants can do is really put under a single umbrella an automation of some of these fundamental tasks about how do you cleanse the data, how do you run the project, how do you do the clean core workshop. And I really liked what Søren said on the keynote very quickly, and then talked about in greater depth in a meeting with some analysts, that this is a way to really break down some of the barriers to the complexity and integration that these tools have because of the way they've been acquired, and really say, okay, we've got these 5 different tasks we need to accomplish in the process of doing the thing that the Toolchain does great. Let's put them into this assistant framework. You don't have to build new functionality. There's nothing net new. It's take what's already there, but make it easier to consume. And I think because it's a bounded domain, that's my favorite sort of idea now about enterprise. When you create these bounded domains for enterprise AI, you really limit the hallucinatory capacity of an LLM and make it focused. They've done a really good job. So I think moving forward, the Toolchain doesn't just have these assistants. Of course, now it has a more important role as a key part of the implementation, cost effectiveness, and velocity of transformation. I think that's really great.
Right. And one of the things I have been a stickler for is to start seeing the results of how these tools can be greater than the sum of their parts. And I think we're still moving towards that, but we did hear some keynote references to LeanIX and Signavio in particular impacting all of this. To me, that brings out a whole different scenario for the benefits you can get from some of these private cloud migrations, which I've been a little bit critical of in terms of like, they haven't really energized me for the most part, though I do recognize they're often a step forward for customers, but it doesn't feel as transformative as I was hoping. And I'm thinking some of these tools may help deliver on that. What do you think?
Well, I think they, the interesting thing about the Signavio business process modeling and the Lean IX, which is more of a network kind of or infrastructure modeling tool, is that they played very well in the basic formation of this tool chain and the basic idea of let's implement, build and design, build and run. And now it turns out these tools are very functional in managing agents as well and managing the agentic focus. So I think there's a lot to be said for how SAP is going to use these tools to layer on a governance function that was very big part of what Christian was talking about in the keynote, and sort of setting down what I call these moats that they then are going to use to defend their right to be first among equals in the AI world. Being able to govern how you manage agents, how agents function, how you design them, how you the hire to retire, if you will, life cycle of an agent. That can be done very, very well with these tools, and in, I think, a very unique way. That's a big deal, because they've got to. If they're not governed well, they're gonna run amok potentially and make more problems than they're worth.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting thing you and I talked about was some folks at SAP. I know they've had a decent amount of cloud ALM adoption, but as a free tool, it has some limitations in terms of getting in front of customers. And ironically enough, the agentic monetization scheme starts to potentially change that. Do you want to explain that?
Yeah, coin-operated sales is what it is. And, there's been a real problem with just getting the field sales excited about something that's free. There's, no built-in incentive. Now there is, because these assistants require agents. The agents, have a monetization commercial policy that goes into it. And now there's a real incentive to sell this. In addition to the fact that they're doing all this extra great important work, field sales actually has a little coin box they can rattle to help them get to sleep at night and when they sell this stuff. So I think that's great. And I think it's gonna make a big difference in terms of customer uptake, and we're gonna see some results. I'm excited about that.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting piece that I saw some progress on is something that I sometimes call the demonetization of Signavio, which I know probably terrifies a lot of executives at SAP to hear me say that. And I'm not trying to be in fantasy land where Signavio is going to come off the price list, but I do think that some of these process intelligence features are too important to require a lot of hoop jumping to get into. And I'm starting to see more signs that SAP is looking to figure out how they can do that in such a way that exposing process intelligence to customers and prospects at crucial points without going into the heavy price list conversation. And then for the more advanced capabilities, sure, I've never had a problem with that. I've just felt like process intelligence, because of the reason you described, is too important right now to really hold behind a paywall. And I think they're making progress on that. I don't want to go too far, but I'm seeing some changes.
Yeah, and there's some the reconfiguration of RISE, which is something we should talk about as well. Includes some bundling of Signavio and Lean IX that's very cost effective. And that's a good start to to do exactly what you were just saying.
So why don't we go there now, since we're kind of on the topic, the reconfiguration of RISE. I thought it didn't get as much keynote airtime, honestly, as I was expecting based on our analyst discussions the day before, but you never really know. I mean, keynotes have their own, time constraints and stuff, but what do you think is the significance of it?
Well, ultimately, the big win for customers is that, their SAP has said, we're going to really support you in your journey to migration to the cloud in a way that makes much more sense for you as a customer, with a proviso, right? Provided that you are going to sign up, for S4, you're going to sign up for RISE. If you become a RISE customer, we're going to let you kind of get to the cloud at your pace, and we will give you, most importantly, access to innovation, particularly AI. I think that's a win for a lot of customers who were told initially, you're not going to get AI and next gen innovation unless you are on S4. Now it's, well, if you're on the way to S4, we'll give it to you. But as we've discussed, that doesn't work for everybody.
No, it does not. And two different pieces of that. One is that I've made the argument to SAP leadership that you need to look very, very hard at what the consequences are of not allowing people to start. If they want to work on AI stuff now, even if they're on a very old release of SAP, why wouldn't you want to be the one to collaborate with them on that and create a business model for that? And I know that SAP is trying to weigh that out for themselves, but I'm just making the point that you have some this isn't like competing with the Epicors and the M4s of the world. You're competing with companies like Anthropic and especially in North America, Palantir, not so much abroad. These are serious companies going into your customer base and trying to win your AI business. And I just think SAP has to think about pushing even further. But having said that, I think it was a good step. And, I can't talk a lot about our German user group discussion because we intentionally made that an off-the-record discussion. Maybe I'll address some of that on the record with them later. But one thing I do know that they would feel comfortable with me saying is they're going to continue to defend the need of on-premise customers to have access to this type of innovation going forward. And so that provokes a very interesting conversation on to what extent does AI have to be tied to the cloud? And I think to a large extent, I don't think it does, but there are also some definite benefits to multi-tenant cloud architectures. I've studied this stuff for too long to feel otherwise, but you're going to have a prominent voice in the SAP community that's not going to back down from that. But having said that, I did see some movement in terms of they're also acknowledging internally that, hey, the ECC thing, you have to start thinking about what you're going to do about that. So there is movement on both sides, and so it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I talked about this more in depth with Connor Reardon. So in the spirit of not duplicating content as I vowed, I think we can move on from that for now, unless you have a comment on it.
No, go ahead. Let's keep going.
Okay. All right. So I don't want to make you wait for the whole podcast for the API discussion. So let me just air out like my current views on this. And I don't want to disappoint listeners, but the API conversation is very complex and nuanced. And at this moment in time of sleep deprivation on the road, I'm not comfortable making very definitive statements around the current state of the API policy discussion. But in general, I think you are aware that I've been critical of all vendors that set up even what appears to be the appearance of data toll roads connected to AI, because I think customers should own their data. But I do think there's a point in time where if you transform that data enough for customers, then you can start making the case that you're providing a value. But I think customers should be really free to experiment, even if, as SAP sometimes has said this week, that doing API calls to external systems or MCP servers results in a less context-rich and a less sort of valuable form of AI. I think customers should still be free to find that out for themselves.
Yeah.
And I think SAP should try to win this game in the market of presenting the best solutions rather than the appearance of restrictions. But I also agree with SAP's general point that the circumstances around how you make data calls into SAP systems has absolutely changed because of agentic systems and bots and all of that. And new rules are going to be needed, including the security and controls that customers expect. I recognize that when you start making that argument too heavily, that if you are able to control and audit everything, that also implies that you could monetize it. So there is like a potential monetization bottleneck that makes people very distrustful. I think most of the LinkedIn discussion on this topic has been utter bullshit, with the exception of a couple people I'll call out. Thomas Webernight, I think, has tried really hard on this topic to advance it. And also, Helena, I'm going to butcher your last name, so I'm not going to try, but you've done a great job, as would expect, of trying to forward some concerns. But anyway, the gist of it is that what happened was that I think SAP would even admit they won't use this language, but they didn't do a good job on this. They did a poor job of the updates to this policy. And what they should have done is done it in the context of partners and customers and co-innovation around it. And what are we going to do? And surface the announcement as a collective entity of concerned citizens in the SAP world. If they had done that, I think it would have been taken in a different context than it was. Having said that, the timing was quite interesting because a lot of the key user group leaders were in Waldorf the week after this came out. And so
yeah,
they were in a position to give direct feedback to SAP. And so now, having met with Philip Herzig last night for an on-the-record article on this topic, he acknowledged that they have taken that user group feedback, particularly from the German user group in ASUG, and pulled it into the FAQ. So the current FAQ, SAP stands behind as an updated document. So if you don't like the FAQ, then you do have a beef with SAP because that document is now what they think is coherent. Now they acknowledge that there's some specific customer-specific questions and issues that are not covered in that. So they probably will expand it further. But I think it's fair to say that SAP now stands by that document. So if you don't like it, you should take it up with SAP. And finally, I will say that the only way this plays out is for SAP partners and customers over time to go onto social channels and say they're happy with stuff. And if they're happy, then ultimately that will carry the day, and the LinkedIn carnival barkers, many of whom, by the way, are not connected to SAP World at all, but just using it to advance certain AI agendas, will fade away and they won't be very important anymore. And one final thing that I thought was interesting as I talked with Philip, I look these people in the eye, right? And I asked them and I presented them with edge cases, including one I had heard from a partner about that involved running their own MCP server. I showed it to Philip, and Philip said, that's legit, that's fine. And it was definitely not going through SAP's integration gateway and using their MCP technology, which arguably may not be the best MCP configuration if we want to get geeky about it. But the point is, Philip said it was fine. Now, whether the partner can't take my word for that, they're going to need to get further validation. But the point is, the way he immediately said it was fine, I thought was a very good sign. And so I think my read on it is SAP is going to get over this hump on this issue. But, this whole issue of data toll roads isn't going away. And that's for every vendor to look at and figure out, how do we protect from a security perspective, but avoid the temptation to over-monetize the wrong channel? Because the right channel is monetizing innovation, not regulating data.
Right.
Anyway, my monologue is done. Josh,
Okay.
What do you think?
Well, I agree 100%. I want to sort of use that as a segue into just a brief little talk about partners, because what you just described is sort of reminds me of this fantasy dream I've had for a number of years, that SAP needs to create an office of the partner advocate or the partner ombudsman, because this is not the first time when a rule has been promulgated that there's an edge case, a legitimate edge case that should not fall under the rule, and yet seems to fall under the rule. And it becomes very difficult. I mean, you're lucky that you got in front of Philip to discuss this. I hope, the partner will hear about this. They obviously will. I had a similar case having to do just with some pricing issues with joining the partner program and what that meant in terms of license and revenue share. I went to the right person on that and found it and resolved it for a particular partner. But I think this is one of the things that's really bugging me about the partner story, is that everything we hear increasingly from SAP, including at this Sapphire, is about how desperately they need partners to succeed, that partners have to fill in some very, very important white space in their strategy and in their products. And yet they really don't have the motion to think, hey, we're going to do this API thing. Maybe we should engage, partners and the user groups first. Let's, we'll sort of, shoot first and then ask questions later. I want to just add on the partner thing, and this is just one aspect of it that I find very compelling and interesting. Søren Reuter said out loud what a lot of folks at SAP haven't been willing to really say clearly. This was in front of some analysts yesterday. SAP and its consultants, anyone who's got an sap.com at the end of their email, isn't allowed to touch non-SAP data, non-SAP processes, full stop. You can put data into BDC. That's what Databricks is for to a large extent. You have tools like Signavio and LeanIX and Cloud ALM that are designed to run and manage non-SAP systems, but the SAP can't do this. But we heard a lot about this year.
They've learned that the hard way.
They learned that the hard way. It's a long story.
Yeah.
Tomorrow Now, look it up. There was a lawsuit. What we heard a lot about that was interesting in this Sapphire was heterogeneity. We heard Christians say it, we heard Mohammed say it. Non-SAP data, non-SAP systems are important. The only way for that to work within this complex set of tools and functions that SAP is talking about, agentic and non-agentic, is if a partner does it. And a partner is one who has the legal trusted authority to do that. SAP needs these partners to be very, very successful and to understand this opportunity and take it to the customers. So more and more, it's just, this sort of irks me that we keep running into these false starts with strategy because someone didn't really think about the impact on a partner or partners in that case. So I'm adding that because the imperative has never been greater to have really successful partners, and not just the big folks. You probably went over that already. We did. You and I. There's too many large global SIs on the keynote stage.
We got that coming in the ASUG talks.
Right, we
QA
did that one
too as well. That's coming out.
The flip side of that, it's not just a good idea to have smaller, interesting boutique partners because they do cool stuff. It's because they're absolutely essential to the strategy, and SAP's got to get out of their own way on that. And like I said, maybe there needs to be this partner advocate role that just steps in and looks at every strategy and says, "Hey, let's talk about what the impact is on partners."
Yep. And I was really struck by how some of the people watching our watch party who aren't as familiar with the ecosystem just are missing a lot of fantastic partners doing cool stuff. SAP has a chance to change that, but we've already agreed we're not going to dwell on that because we've covered that very well.
Even though we just did.
Yeah, but we didn't do the deep dive though, so that's good. Anyhow, this is the moment I've kind of been waiting for, Josh, because there's a big question looming over this podcast, and it's not a 50-cent question, Josh.
Okay.
It's a much more expensive.
Drum roll, please.
It's a much more expensive question because you've been very critical of agentic AI, and have at times sort of like relegated it to the land of 50-cent problems. It's your famous talking point. If you want to hear more rants, Josh, on that, check out Alexander Greb's podcast he did with Josh a while back, Transformation Every Day, great podcast series. You and I are going to be talking with Alexander actually to oversaturate further the podcast content. So you've had a history of this, and you and I think feel a little differently about it, though I think largely we're fairly aligned in our overall views of this wave of AI technology that we call agentic AI, which is actually LLM agents for the most part.
Right.
But the question is really sitting there, Josh, because you can't assess SAP strategy now without dealing with the autonomous, which implies agentic LLM technology at the heart of SAP's forward messaging. So how do you reconcile that with your prior critiques, and where do you sit on this now? Because I know that you're someone who evolves your views. So where are we now?
So thank you. I'm how should I put it, humble enough to say, maybe I need to tone it down a little bit and be more accepting. And quite frankly, I was very impressed with how the story was told. This Sapphire in particular, as I've said in other places, they defined a bunch of moats around context, around data, around process that are defensible, and they argued, I think, well for the defense of them as this is the bounded domain in which SAP and its AI can be very, very successful. I like that a lot. I'm a little, I'm still going little wincing when I hear autonomous. We both wince when we hear autonomous.
Yeah.
And in particular, there was a customer who was, I'm not going to name names, who was mentioned on stage during the keynote, but who was with us in the analyst day 0. And I asked specifically, would they be allowing their supply chain to be autonomous? And the answer was no, not fully autonomous, but a human in the loop as always. And I think here's where I'm really evolving. I think that the ability of the human in the loop to leverage a lot of very well considered and very highly functional AI technology and use it to automate and gain greater levels of productivity is real now. I think we're really seeing it. It's still early days. I still need more proof points. But the answer to the question of, Josh, say that maybe this AI stuff is real. I think it is. And again, this is what I liked about what I saw in the keynote and some of the one-on-ones is that SAP, in this concept of, we understand, we have this context, we have this special understanding about how business works. We have these literally millions of data points. We have these decades of experience. Within the context of that, we can build an LLM-based AI and non-LLM-based AIs that actually delivers real value. So I'm coming around to a limited and yet, I'll say, I recognize there's value there. I get it.
So kudos for being willing to humble yourself enough to evolve a little bit.
Yeah, right.
No, it's not easy. I mean, I've had to do that a little bit on a different topic, which is my defense of SaaS market value versus AI. And I do think that the way value is distributed across software and AI infrastructure is changing. I write about that weekly in His and Misses. I have not backed off on some of my core views, which I think is sort of similar to you on this point, but I've had to change. And, I think it's healthy. Like, I think it's healthy for us to reassess, but it's tricky, right? Because we get known for these talking points and then people assume that that's how we feel. And, I think where I always perceived your criticism is that I sort of see three waves of enterprise AI. I see the initial wave was kind of using off-the-shelf models for things, freelancing essentially. And some of that is still happening for sure, of using off-the-shelf models for enterprise workloads. Not only is that insecure, but I don't think it's sustainable or scalable. And so I always felt that way. The next wave was sort of embedding generative AI into generalized productivity processes, which I think was mostly wildly overrated. And in terms of the cost of that technology versus the result, having it write generic emails and stuff like that and schedule meetings. And
the 50-cent problem.
These are the 50 cent. That's what I was going to get to, is I think that I associate that type of generative AI with definite 50-cent problems. Whether it's agentic or not, I don't really care. It's still a 50-cent scenario. Where I think it gets a lot more interesting and where I have differed, I think, in your views for a while, is the potential to embed this type of technology much more deeply into industry and into workflows. And that's where I've seen the more persuasive use cases. Now, having said that, there still needs to be a very rigorous analysis of what agentic AI is good for and what it's not. And we don't have time for all of that today. But one of the things that I think is important to understand, it's good at a few things. One is pulling information from, it does have to be like quality data on some level. We could talk about that, but pulling from very disparate sources, whether it's, Levi's used an example of servicing, onboarding smaller customer partners, suppliers, et cetera, with like documents are all over the place, PDFs, emails, all this stuff, pulling all that into one frame and auto-populating a lot of that for users, that kind of thing is a strength of this technology. Obviously, user interaction is a huge strength. And I think that comes with dangers because sometimes you can become too trusting of what you're being served up.
Right.
And you have to insist on explainability and rigor. But there's no question that this, one of the reasons enterprises are so horny, if I might use that word for this technology, is because it solves UX problems that have befuddled customers and kept enterprise software in the domain of super users for far too long, right? RIP Michael Doan. But that was always his thing, right? And the software sucks for anyone who's not a super user and, even hated the term. But so I think that's another piece. But one of the other pieces that's really important to understand is this so-called reasoning capability, which I don't view as the same as human reasoning. But the point is that an LLM agent properly utilized can break down a task into a series of tasks. And to your bounded point, that then gets handed off to a very specialized agent. Right. And for the SAP example, the Joule for Consultants one that they talked about in the second day keynote is a good example of that, right? Where you're essentially interacting with an overarching assistant, but then depending on what you need to do, clean your code or whatever, you have a specialized agent, your sort of bounded terminology, right? That's much more focused on that task. And so I find that persuasive, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that this is very early days, right? So this is way, way too soon to really say, and you've been rightly critical of some of the, we saved this or that. And it's kind of like, well, how exactly and what form of it was it really the agents that saved you that money? Or was it the other work you did on machine learning? Or was it the other work you did,
did on consolidation?
These things all get like jumbled together. So I think it gets a little bit tricky. Like I interviewed this customer aeroporters I'm going to be writing about, and they built this really cool, they manage all these airports, and they built this really cool sort of quote unquote snow agent that basically, they won a bunch of awards for this, but basically it's going to hopefully alert them to all kinds of weather issues, like in a more real-time way than ever before, right? And pulling from all these disparate data sources and all of that. Really exciting, but winter hasn't hit South America yet. So we can't actually talk about what
it's
that is.
It's coming up.
Though. It's coming.
Yeah, it's fall right now. Yeah,
it is. It's coming in a couple months.
Yeah.
So I think that's a sort of a good window into where a lot of this is at, especially in the SAP community, is that we we're unable to totally validate these use cases because a lot of the action is sort of like still being set forth.
Yeah.
So,
and I just want to make a quick comment on the usability thing. I mean, one of the things that I have been critical of is the fact that there's some of these cases that these use cases where look what AI did in terms of a significant return on investment turns out to have been really based on a system consolidation or some other baseline function. But fundamentally, this ability to essentially, even if you don't do that, even if you don't do the heavy lifting, and you can't, right, to rebuild the back end, to consolidate all the data, to standardize, you can use agents to streamline a lot of disparate paths. I met with I'll drop a name here, Sam Yen, this morning, and he called it swivel chair integration. You can get rid of a lot of swivel chair integration with some smart agents, and even though you haven't actually built the hardcore integration underneath it, you've done a lot more than RPA to make a process more usable and a process make more sense. So I think we're going to have to sort of look for those, and they're not 50-cent wins. They're not necessarily $1 million wins either, but they're there in the context of real value.
But I would argue that they are $1 million wins ultimately because in many cases they're repeatable. Like, so once you do it, you can apply it to other processes and other domains, and that's where it starts to add up. And the reason why that's not getting more attention is that the frontier model companies are under way more pressure to generate much, much bigger revenues and that much faster.
Right.
And so it doesn't get a lot of attention, but the enterprise folks that care about this stuff make a note of like, wait, this is a relatively modest game, but it matters in this context, and it can be applied to other areas, and it will matter there too. And I think that's where it gets interesting. But to use the RPA example, that does not render RPA irrelevant as many of the AI Krishnas would fantasize. Like, in fact, the whole point of this is to understand the differences between the probabilistic and deterministic technologies and not throw away your deterministic stuff when it's completely reliable and does what it needs to do by the way, at a much lower cost baseline as well. So I think that's one of the things that I think you and I are both equally frustrated by, is that it doesn't supersede everything else.
Right. It can't, it's not a one-stop
In fact, it's dependent on the other things for the really good results, which is sort of why.
And that's it. The mixed mode.
Yeah.
This is what, I've been saying this for a while. I'll just get on and off the soapbox real quick. Not all AI is LLM.
Right.
Not all productivity in AI comes from a probabilistic model. We've been doing a lot of really cool stuff, in AI for decades, and some of it's extremely valuable and remains so. And I'm happy that everyone's focused on AI. I just want everyone to focus on all the AI that's out there, not just the LLMs.
Well, and SAP, even though it's been emphasizing autonomy, and I want to talk about that for a moment before we switch off this topic. SAP has heard you in that sense, or maybe they decided that it was their own idea, not yours. But with the tabular foundation model investments they're making, they're not going to build an LLM, but they want to, with the acquisition, the prior labs, and their own announcement of RPT 1.5 this week, Rapid 5, I guess is the proper pronunciation. They want to build this tabular foundation model, and this is largely inspired by predictive AI and making predictive AI a lot easier for companies to build and utilize. Now, it will be incorporated into agentic structures as well, but the point is that's driven by the motivation to help companies do predictive models at scale.
Yeah.
So
nothing
there
like
you go.
An agent that links up some predictive AI models. I'm all for it.
So there you go.
All right.
Okay. So now we've captured your change of views there. Now, autonomy, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it because we've hit on it from different angles before. I think it energizes SAP, the autonomous thing, but I've talked to SAP about this, and I think they largely agree that, in fact, they're presenting a much more nuanced approach to the technology when you get under the hood. So autonomous might sound cool on stage, at least to SAP. I don't know. I think customers, here's my interpretation. I think customers were more inspired by SAP's sort of confidence in direction than necessarily the phrase.
Right.
That's my current feeling. But when you dig into how SAP's designed these things, and you talked like the supply chain customer that you talked about that said, I would never be fully autonomous. They weren't at all saying that they're not comfortable with where SAP is going, because In fact, they've probably looked under the hood and seen that SAP allows them a lot of control. And I call this granular autonomy, but it's the idea that every customer should be able to dictate within their own comfort zone and their own compliance requirements and everything else, the degree of autonomy that they want for a particular process. And SAP actually is thinking the same line. So despite the buzzwords, there's a more complex story that is more human-centric, and SAP believes that, I believe, in how they've designed it, but it does get a little bit lost in the autonomous enterprise messaging.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, this customer is a logo customer on main stage. They're doing advanced, lighthouse work in AI and agentic AI. They're not afraid of it. They're running towards it, not away from it. Just this very specific question got this very specific answer, and it sort of added that nuance that I thought was important.
I have a closing question for you, but before I get there, did we miss anything that
One
you really
thing,
want to talk
yes,
about?
I really do. So one of the things that we felt and we've discussed elsewhere that was missing in the keynote stage on both days
I think I know what you're going to
was
say.
the Omni crisis, was the fact that the customers are really struggling in this very, very complex and chaotic world. And we've heard this previously from keynote stage. We didn't hear it this time. Hey, SAP is here to help you. SAP's got some solutions that can really help you manage this chaos. We didn't hear that loud and strong enough. I think it was a real shame. And in particular because I had 3 really great meetings. You were in one of them with Tasha Thurman, one of our favorites. There was also Dominic.
And she said, actually, she challenged us. She was like, hold up. How come you didn't hear my keynote? Because I addressed this and we were like, sorry, we got over-programmed as usual.
Right. But because Tasha doesn't let this stuff miss a second. Dominic Metzger running supply chain. I talked to him about it. Jörn Keller, who's another, I think the CPO for the business network. Tony Harris. I talked to all these folks about it, and the sum of those those conversations was business network and the supply chain functionality. SAP. This is where SAP can meet customers in the Omni crisis to really make them excel. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of things, and here's agentic meets opportunity. One of the things that they're doing in the business network and in the now revamped Ariba is making the supplier onboarding an agentic process. Brilliant. Just press a button and get my suppliers onboarded. Stop monkeying around. Stop making it a mess. Make it simple. Get that over with. Low cost, low barrier to entry. Boom. So I think what I would have loved to hear is maybe they should have just teed up Tasha's keynote, and that would have been enough. We do this thing called solve the Omni crisis. Go hear these things, because they do, and that's really important. SAP is truly one of the only ones in the market who can do this at scale and in a complex world, provide some relatively easy pathways to find your way out of a crisis. I think that needed to be said more.
Yeah, and I think ultimately my view is it's about building systems that can keep up with all the changes in this world, and that includes some of the real-time context I want to get into in our closing remarks. But SAP is actually all of their solutions that they talked about are based on that concept, which starts with where the customer's predicaments are at, and that basically what we've equipped customers with is just not good enough for what they're dealing with in the world today. And it helps to say that.
Yeah,
it helps to kind of name it instead of sort of jumping to the solution without outlining the problem statement. And I don't know, I'm just totally speculating here, but I think that SAP has tried to remain a little bit above the political fray, and they're worried that speaking to global circumstances starts to drag them into that a bit. And I understand a little bit where that concern is coming from, because things get so unnecessarily politicized so quickly. Like, I get so frustrated that every sustainability conversation has to set people off one way or the other, when in fact, like, it's just downright idiotic not to want to talk about running your business more efficiently and reducing energy consumption and having granular monitoring of all that stuff. It's just stupid not to be able to have that conversation. But vendors have told me this is a hot potato or whatever, and it's like, oh my God, you've got to be kidding me.
Yeah, polarization.
And I just think, and I've said this before, so I won't dwell on it, but I think SAP has the potential to be kind of a mature global voice in these conversations and speak to global problems and instability with a company that kind of can withstand that stuff. And I think that matters. And I'd like to see them embrace that a little bit more but acknowledging and understanding that there's some risk to doing that, but I think the reward is higher than the risk, in my opinion.
Well, I agree. I'd love to see a little leadership there. And again, I think it's safer than it looks, because the stories, when we talk to customers individually, and I've been surprised, where I say, I don't want to talk about politics, but let's talk about the economy. And they're like, oh, we can talk about politics and the economy, because at the end of the day, we're sitting here trying to deal with this very complex situation. And without talking about who I'd vote for, I want to talk about, I vote for the economy, so let's talk about the economy. So I think people would embrace leadership, and I think SAP, like you said, as a transnational, multinational company, could do a lot to to provide that leadership.
So before, just adding to the podcast fire, before Sapphire, you and I were on a ASUG Talks earning review conversation with SAP just had a good earnings report. Now they're getting hammered in the investor markets again. That's a different conversation around the long game that SAP is trying to play versus some of the irrationality. But in that conversation, I talked. It's an ASUG Talks. You can look it up there. I talked about, I really appreciate how articulate Christian Klein is around the nature of LLM technology, its pros and cons, and how SAP is dealing with turning that into value for customers, and kind of hammering a little bit at why the off-the-shelf models don't do that. And not all software CEOs are really articulate about that. And I wanted to note that in a Sapphire context, because when we talked about a more confident SAP on stage, I think that starts with Christian Klein, and it's important to just note that I thought he felt just more in his element than I've ever seen him before on stage. And, obviously some of that is just keynote stuff, because, I've noticed that he's been more and more confident interacting with us privately for several years now. But I kind of felt like this was his sort of like moment of like, I'm on the stage. This is where we're headed.
Yeah.
And I think that's enormously reassuring to customers. So I felt like I should just note that.
Yeah, and it played well, definitely.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. So here's the challenging closing question for you, which is, oh crap, we also forgot to talk about Connect in the fall.
Okay, quickly.
So let's talk about SAP Connect, because this is a show that kind of was, I think, somewhat inspired by a blog post that you wrote about the heterogeneous enterprise.
Thank you. Well,
right?
I won't take credit for moving this.
But you wrote about why we need to have a conference that's dedicated to these lines of business.
Right. And I will take credit for having had multiple conversations, particularly with Mohammed Alam, about this, and I'm very happy to have seen this conference show up, and it's focused on the line of business. It's focused on getting not just the story out for the CIO, but for business stakeholders. And it's coming up in October. We will be there.
Yeah, and that ties into something that I saw from some of the CX analysts on site that Thomas Weber and I've also been hammering, which is like, where is CX in all this? And we saw more of that in the keynote demos for sure the last couple of years, including this year. We had H&M retail customer on stage as well. But SAP Connect show is a chance for SAP to really drive home these different lines of business and how that all intersects. And I think, whether it's CX or success factors or spend, like all this stuff connects. And in fact, we didn't talk about our business case workshop, which we were planning to do, because we had a really interesting business case workshop. I'd like you to speak briefly on that. But it's all about like helping people connect the dots. And in this case, using basis technologies in SAP Partner, using sort of a customized version of LLM technology, you could say, in a short version, to like help coach customers. It's not the only thing the tool does, but it helps coach customers into seeing who all these stakeholders are across all these lines of business, with the goal of building better business cases, but also being able to talk more effectively as an SAP leader to all of your line of business colleagues in a way that resonates with them.
Right.
And I think it's really important, and it ties into this whole discussion.
Yeah. And I think, we did this workshop during the ASUG, under ASUG. We had Basis Technologies there with their Clario tool. And like, we're using a subset of it, but what that tool is able to do in this particular context is really take a business problem and kind of explode it out into its component elements, particularly in terms of who are the relevant business stakeholders. What is the problem? How does the problem look to them? What is the language they use? What are the metrics they use? And how do you get an architect, an IT person, someone who's not necessarily even maybe a business person, but not in that particular domain, to understand the depth and breadth of a business problem as its impact traverses an entire organization? And what I love about this exercise, we've been working with Basis. This is our third workshop. I think we cracked the code in terms of how to do the right kind of workshop for the audience. There's always that aha moment where you we were working with a warehouse problem, when you find out that warehouse problem impacts domains you might not have thought of: HR, risk management, legal, obviously operations, obviously supply chain, obviously the office of the CFO. And then, of course, when you see the interconnections between the two of them, you sort of it spells out the story of why we need to break down silos, of why we need conferences like Connect, because we need to get these different parts of the organization working together.
Well, and the cool part too is seeing, obviously it's not, the technology helps to spark the conversations and bring things to a head, which is really nice. And it helps you to even generate really high quality emails, getting back to the generating emails conversation, but with the information that's really relevant and putting it in the frame of what your stakeholder cares about, not what you care about. Right. And what I think is really cool is sort of like identifying the surprise stakeholders that you never expected were a part of it.
Yeah.
And also, who's going to be your blockers? Who's going to stand in the way of what you're trying to do inside?
And how do I communicate with them?
Yeah.
I mean, that was when you talked about emails. I mean, what this tool does is say, generate an email for me. In this case, that I would use to try to get 15 minutes with one of my blockers, and again, convince them that I'm going to have a conversation that's worth their while. And as our friend Todd Hassel said, and he was part of this. He's a value advisor. He's been in the room more than once on this. He said, if you can get those blockers to be your allies, you've got a really strong story. And I thought it was really, people really noticed this when we said, how do we do this? Tell us what the languages we use. How do we unite blockers and allies and do a better job? This ability to look at a business problem and see it as a problem, not just for the one domain in which it started, but a problem for the whole company that the whole company has to solve. I think this is gold. This is where we solve the productivity gap that we've seen from IT spending for the entire century.
And by the way, Josh and I want to keep putting this out there, this type of program, and maybe in some virtual settings. Definitely hoping to do something along these lines at ASUG Tech Connect if ASUG is still willing to put up with us.
I think they're good. I think they'll let us.
Yeah, we can be a little high maintenance. Let's just accept that about ourselves. But the other thing I wanted to just quickly say about that, which is really cool, is that when you and I picked up on this, it was because we heard from SAP leaders at events like ASUG Tech Connect. They were struggling with these issues and struggling to, enterprise architects, a lot of them, and senior SAP leaders just having trouble talking to.
How do I make
business.
the business case?
Yep.
How do I convince my users to move beyond?
And how do I even just talk and create a narrative that's compelling and all of that?
Tell the story.
And so for a little while, it was sort of the John and Josh traveling minstrel show. But along the way, we picked up SAP Value Advisory. We had the backing of ASUG. We have Basis Technologies building, an example of a cool partner stepping in and building cool stuff. And basically, like, I love that vision of like the community across different groups and interests, like banding together to try to help solve these kinds of problems. And I hope we see more of that, because to me, that was always the thing I liked most about working in the SAP community was when that kind of stuff happened.
And right. And it was a community effort. It was a team taught sort of session. There was, there was everybody in the room. It was great. It worked really well.
Very cool. All right. So we do need to head out. I'm worried. I'm paranoid that we're going to get like kicked out.
We're about to get kicked out, right?
Yeah.
You can hear them outside.
But just real quick, the closing question. I guess it's been almost an hour, but I'm not bored yet, so I don't think our listeners are going to.
Hopefully not, but yeah, we've been.
Yeah. Pick one or two or three things for someone who wasn't here that they that you don't want them to miss that they might have like missed that are not like keynote headlines or whatever, something that you think they should pay attention to. And if you need a moment, I can go first.
You go first.
Okay. So industry AI.
Oh, damn. He took that one.
Okay. Let me pass that on to you then.
No. Go ahead. Take it. Go on.
Okay. Well, I'll just do it short and you can elaborate on it if you want to. I think one of the more compelling parts of what SAP talked about, it was in the keynote, but it wasn't the focal point exactly. It's co-innovation projects basically on an industry basis. I think that's the future of enterprise AI is industry AI. So that's one thing to just track. The other thing I want to pick is SAP really shocked me because I've been working on research around what I call real-time organizational truth, because I believe that what agents really need to appear intelligent, like or relevant, if you don't want to use the word intelligent, right, is they need access to the greatest sense of organizational truth they can obtain. And I believe that spans not just structured systems, but unstructured systems. It includes external data like weather data. It includes non-SAP data. It includes also things that the venture capital community is excited about. Foundation Capital made a bunch of noise around context graphs as $1 trillion opportunity. And their whole thing was around all the organizational knowledge that is in all these channels like Slack and all of that, and also in people's heads that never gets documented. So we're back to the revenge of knowledge management, by the way. But I call it real-time organizational truth. And no enterprise vendor and no venture capitalist has ever really captured, I think, the full picture of it. So that's why I'm trying to research it, and I'm going to write more about it. The May 8th edition of Disrupt TV, I went into this in detail, why I think it matters. You can listen to that. But what SAP did that surprised me is I brought it up at the analyst meeting around the so-called context layer, because that's one name for it. And SAP didn't have good answers, but they pulled me aside. Manoj's team pulled me aside and said, we're working on something. And
this is back in February.
Yeah,
right.
They said, we're working on something. So I met with them before this conference, and they unveiled this company memory concept that they mentioned briefly in the keynote. But the company memory concept is essentially starting to document all those knowledge patterns inside of organizations. And what's crucially important about it is that obviously a lot of those things can conflict. So you need a dynamic way of tracking that can update, because you might give a customer a discount, but I might give the customer a different discount. And so what is the truth there, right? And I love this concept of pushing for truth, and agents get exposed very quickly when they don't have it. And on the Disrupt TV thing, I talked about this insanely like obvious example of a mouse that I had to replace, and the new one had a red light. And I did a search on Google Gemini, which is a frontier model with millions and millions of training data points, telling me that meant that the mouse was low on batteries or defective. But in fact, this new version of the mouse, that's a sign that it's trying to pair. So I wasted literally an hour and a half. So that model went from, arguably really intelligent to incredibly stupid in like 30 seconds. And that's what can happen in an enterprise context as well.
Right.
And so pay attention to this company memory thing and what SAP can do with it, because if SAP combines that with the tabular model stuff they do and everything else, they might have one of the more like compelling and holistic approaches to AI that we've seen. Now, granted, SAP has a lot of obstacles ahead to achieving that. But I really like, they're the only vendor in the entire space that I dealt with this spring that really moved on this. So there you go.
Okay. I'll get you 3. I don't need to, you did a good enough job on industry.
Okay.
Anyway, I just want to shout out though that yes, industry is strong at SAP, and industry specific functionality, whether it's agentic or not, is a real differentiator. I think they're doing a really good job of that. And I think if you're, whatever industry you're in, there was an interesting moment in the keynote when I think it was Thomas said, who's here because they're, who's using an industry specific piece of functionality from SAP. And there wasn't a lot of hands in the audience, but we know they're using it. It's just not something you identify with. So this is to reverse that. I'd say, think about if you're a user, you're listening to this, am I using the industry functionality that's relevant for my domain? You want to look into that and make sure you are, because I think they have a really strong industry story. Grow fast and grow in general. The SME challenge or the SME opportunity. We heard several times that this is a huge growth opportunity for SAP. It's going to be the volume market for them. It's going to be partner led. We talked about problems with partners. I won't do this again. We're going to, the one thing I will add, and I mentioned this to Christian when I saw him on Monday, SAP right now doesn't have a destination event for small and medium-sized customers who want to run with Grow.
Oh, Josh, you're trying to make SAP add another big event to their calendar. Oh my God.
But here we go. I mean, we've been at this for several decades, you and I, John, and we know that without the destination event, you don't build community. The community that we are part of, that we've been part of, that people are part of here at Sapphire is because Sapphire has been doing this forever. And I think it's a mistake for SAP to think about an SME partner-led opportunity without that. Third point, several times we heard the idea that pricing is going to start looking at value and outcome as an element of pricing. And when that starts turning into gain sharing, my hackles go up. So I want everyone, and we asked Jeff Scott about this. I'll preview that. Listen to our podcast with Jeff Scott from the show floor yesterday. He had some interesting comments on that. But I just keep an eye out for that because that's something that you're going to hear more of. I'm not a big fan of gain sharing. I'm not a big fan of outcome-based pricing because you got to define outcomes in a very specific way. That's hard to do, but it's certainly something that's looming on the horizon, and we'll probably be talking about it for the rest of the year.
Right. And just three more quick things. The moving target of AI pricing is big. That is in my Connor Reardon podcast, so check that out. That's already out. Also, my advocacy for public cloud ERP has not backed off one bit, despite agentic AI.
Yep.
And we didn't have time to cover that. Colin and I got into it a bit. And then, of course, Clean Core and all of the implications of that is still a very potent discussion. But we're an hour into it. We got to stop. We got to move on. You and I almost got kicked out of here, and we're going to not be able to check out on time if we don't get out of here. It's been a bit of a long podcast, but I'm hoping that somewhere some listener is stuck in traffic or on a treadmill at the gym or hanging out in an airport because their plane got delayed. And if you're out there and you're listening to this and you're like, thanks for helping me kill an hour, well, I hope we did. So,
all right. That's a great way to close.
Catch you later.
All right. Thanks, John.
Bye.